Alright, so we're going to skip then, kind of just take a leap forward to about right before 800 AD. So this idea that there's catechumenal schools, catechetical schools, is taking us into the 300s and the 400s, and there's kind of not a lot developing. There's small steps developing. Of course, by the 300s, into the 300s, you're going to start having buildings going up because Christianity is not outlawed anymore. It's tolerated, it's allowed, and so you have physical growth being seen. And actually, you know, if you have a place to meet and you can call it a school, you can really, if you're just trying to exist and make sure that it's hard to have a school when you're just trying to exist. So, anyway, so education advances. We'll talk about that again, actually, in our early American history. We'll see the same idea. But it advances slowly, steadily. The ideas of education and what we would see with a place, with a classroom or something like that is growing. And we'll come to 800, right before 800 AD. 800, well, basically we would generally say like from 500 to 1500 is the, what would you call it? 500 to 1500 AD. Anybody call those, what's that?
Dark Ages.
The Dark Ages. Of course they were the Dark Ages. You know, all the pictures you ever see of them are black and white, and it's always cloudy. So it had to be Dark Ages. I'm mocking because I always used to think that way. I mean, it's just, you hear that term Dark Ages, you think, oh, it must have been bad back then. The sun never shined. Crops never grew. It was terrible. It was dark. I mean, it's just bad. It's just always bad. Everybody was melancholy. It was just terrible. And obviously it wasn't that way, was it? I mean, the world was the same as it is now. Not the technology that we have, but sunshine, it rained, there was great crops, you know, different things happened. It wasn't the advancements in medicine and all that, but people lived, they enjoyed themselves, they had fun, they learned. Okay? Some of the reason that the Dark Ages are called the Dark Ages is because of the pride of the people in the Enlightenment. Of course, they were the enlightened people. And what were they enlightened with? As a matter of fact, human reason, okay, not the Bible. Okay? Enlightenment was not a celebration of biblical principles. And so there you got all this human reason. They look, oh yeah, back in the Dark Ages, when people still believe things like the Bible. Okay, I'm not saying everything that happened in the Dark Ages was biblical. Okay, but can you see how just that pejorative term comes around and it puts something in our mind that we think this way. Another thing we should recognize as honest historians is that what the Catholic Church was in 1500 when Martin Luther broke from it is not what the Catholic Church was in 500. Okay? In 500 there was probably more of a lowercase c Catholic Church. People, they recognized, like we still recognize, that people who believe the same as us in other places, there's some kind of common bond between us. There's a Catholicity between us. As much as we don't like the word, that's what it is. There's a commonness between us. Okay? And then, I'm saying, I know things happen. The pastor of the church at Rome grew in power. I'm not denying what happened historically, but we can't say that because when he was first called Pope, that means everybody that called themselves a Christian at that time was praying to Mary. They didn't believe in praying to Mary at that time. If they called themselves a Christian at that time, they probably were a Christian. It took time for these things to change. Okay? So, and I'm saying that to bring us to 800. 800, a couple hundred years later, we're progressing towards something that's not so good, and we see signs of some things that are not so good. But 800 and we're progressing and we're digressing, degressing, whatever. The Roman Empire loses its power especially in the West, in Rome, okay, in Italy, and because it's being attacked from the north, okay, by the barbarians, right? And the barbarians do not have any understanding, or they have not heard much about Christianity at all, okay? So, and they're still they're vicious. They know how to fight in war, but they don't have the culture that Rome had got, and that Roman got from Greece. So their civilization, they're less civilized, whatever. That's them. There's less civilization there. So, in a certain sense, there's kind of a downward trend with the fall of Rome in just the general sense, things that happen in life. Not completely down in the tubes, like we're back to, the day after Adam and Eve fell in the garden. But things aren't progressing. Knowledge isn't celebrated and all that type of thing. People obviously have to get by in life. So they are learning and all this, but we're not having great advancements. It's kind of going down. And even to the point where leaders in churches, many of them couldn't even read by the time we get into the 700s. Okay? Now that's down. That's bad. It doesn't mean they can't talk. It doesn't mean they can't get up and say, you ought to do this or whatever. But whatever they're doing, they're just things that they've heard and been taught from other people. They can't even read. That's a problem. Okay? And this is just a real quick view of it. There's a lot more to fill in, and maybe if you went and really filled it in, there'd be slight adjustments to this, but this is the big picture. A man comes along called, we're going to jump right to Charlemagne. Charlemagne. His father, I watched a video that was very interesting, but I didn't think there was enough information related to what we're talking about to make you guys watch it. So it's 45 minutes. It wasn't that long, but it's, we have Charles Martel and Pepin the Short and I don't know, whatever these people are. But Charlemagne is where I think we can just focus here to get us up to speed, like what's been going on. Charlemagne was a ruler in what we might call the Germany, Austria area. It wasn't that at that time. He was a Frankish ruler. And he expanded the boundaries of his control completely. He expanded and he kind of firmed up the border with Spain, which in Spain was all Muslims, the Moors. So he firms up that border. He expands into the north, up toward the northern border of Europe. And he is a follower of Christendom. Okay? And some people, looking at the things he tried to accomplish with his life and the things he said, actually believe he was a saved man. It's very hard to say. Okay, we're looking at 800. It's hard to say what, none of us are perfect in our understanding of things. So you see some error there. Just because we see error doesn't mean we say, well, anybody that would listen to that person with error must be lost. There's no way they can be saved. So it's hard to say exactly. And he does some things. When he conquers, especially those in the north, those barbarians in the north, he makes them become Christians. They must become Christians. Okay? Or they can't live. He's extra zealous. Okay? There's two things going on there. And one probably stronger than the other. He was a ruler. If they didn't follow the laws that he had in place, and they weren't just laws like you must go to church, just the general laws of how the land would be run, they were rebels. They would get together and form another rebellion and get an army together and fight against them. So this is political and spiritual. Okay? It's political, I think, the sword part of it. It's political that they had to become Christians. Spiritual in the sense that he purposely left missionaries behind to teach those barbarians about Christianity. What kind of Christianity it was? I'm not going to say it was bad or good. It was 800. It was a long time ago. There could, even if we say this is what they believed in 800, how many hundreds of missionaries were there? How many of them could read the scriptures for themselves? And there'd be that many different flavors of the Christianity at the time. There could have been a lot of good things happening then. And there could have been a lot of things with a dark, because it was the Dark Ages, cloud over it. So he leaves missionaries there. In 800, on Christmas Day in 800, probably the most significant date in this period of history, he is crowned emperor by the Pope, by Leo III, Emperor of the Romans. This is also a political move because the Pope or the bishop in Rome had lost a lot of power through all this barbarians coming. The Roman church or the Catholic church or the Christian church in the East was still thriving, was still pretty strong and influential. So the Pope in Rome thought, well, if I make an alliance with this guy who is expanding up into the north, then I can be influential over that area. So, there's a lot of political intrigue going on here. And Charlemagne actually was gracious enough to accept that and not try to exert influence over the former Roman Empire that still was running just fine. He could have said, well, now I'm the Emperor of Rome, all you people over in Turkey and Greece and all that need to start listening. You're under my subjection because the Pope in Rome said. He was not that way. Anyway, so some significant accomplishments of Charlemagne is in the area of education, and that's why we bring him up. At this point in time, he brings about, or is instrumental in helping bring about a recovery of the Roman style of learning. So, and the Roman Greek style of learning is an emphasis on the 7 liberal arts. The trivium, which are more language related, and the quadrivium, which are more numbers or mathematics related. The trivium, language related, there's 3 subjects in the trivium: grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. And those have a linguistic base. And then there's 4 subjects in the quadrivium: mathematics, music, geometry, and astronomy. And those all have like a numerical base to them. And those 7 subjects are what were, or at least what are going to become known as the 7 liberal arts. If you went to a liberal arts school, you would learn those 7 liberal arts. We must remember, and I'll get to your question, we must remember that there's a lot of different subjects related to those titles. Remember in the Greek education when they learned their music, there was like all kinds of other things that they learned in music? Still the same idea going on here. There's a little more specification here, but still real broad topics within those. You want me to repeat them? Which ones? The trivium is going to be grammar, trivium, grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. A word we use more often now for dialectic is logic. Okay, so grammar, logic, and rhetoric, or grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. And then the quadrivium, the 4, mathematics, music, geometry, and astronomy. Charlemagne was able to bring a mini, what we would call a reformation, to the church. And he did this by making them learn something, by educating the clergy. Remember I said even the clergy, they couldn't even read? Okay? So he pushed for that they ought to learn how to read. Educate them. They were, and he taught that they ought to read literature and learn literature. An important point is made by Charlemagne. I think we recognize the truth of it. But his point with learning literature was that since the Bible is written as literature, and there's many different literary forms in the Bible, if we learn literature and understand how to read literature, when we run across those forms in the Bible, we will more quickly and more easily understand what is being taught by that in the Bible. Somebody said something along those lines in one of our discussions. Okay? When we read the Bible, it's not just a bunch of words. It's in a certain style. And that style, it's important to understand if we're reading poetry or a proverb or a prophecy or apocalyptic revelation or a history. Those, we have to interpret those properly. You might not think, well, I'm not an interpreter. Well, you are. You read a proverb in a different way than you read a song. And we do that naturally. And some of the reason we can do that somewhat naturally is because we've learned some literature. And you're going to do it even better and more quickly if we as you learn from literature. That was his point there. And also, taught them to learn Latin. Now, languages always move and change. I don't know, every several years they add words to the dictionary. They might even take words out. They have to take words out of those little desk dictionaries that are not looked up too often or used. So our languages change, and the Latin language was changing, as heading toward French and other things. And so, but Charlemagne helped, not personally, but he encouraged the establishment of Latin and the standardization of Latin. And the man that helped most with that was an educator called Alcuin. A-L-C-U-I-N. Alcuin. Joy?
The Latin, is he teaching this to the people or to the clergy?
Yes. Yeah. Primarily the clergy and the government, people that are going to run in the administration of the government. And we're jumping ahead here, but he didn't just pick nobility. In fact, he found that the children of nobles were lazy. And so, but he would pick children of nobles, and he'd pick children of common people who would work hard, and all those different classes of people. Not every child, but there would be different classes of people in the same classroom learning from his palace teachers, school administrators, because he wanted people that were able to be able to run the administration of the government and to be clergy to teach the people. And so, but Alcuin was instrumental in standardizing the Latin language. He invented a lowercase alphabet. Okay. If you've had textual criticism, you've heard the word uncial, U-N-C-I-A-L. You don't need to write that down. But before Alcuin comes along, they always write in capital letters. It's like they shout at everybody all the time. He invents a lowercase manuscript of the Latin language, and Charlemagne and he have enough influence that and Charlemagne has enough, money and power to pay people to be translating the Greek works into Latin, and so there's a lot of educational things going on, and so a lot of stuff is written in this one variation, Alcuin's variation of the Latin language, and there's a huge amount of materials put into Latin. So that just doing that work and using the same set of letters, written the same way, standardizes and prolongs the Latin language so that it's still very much used today. And we would call it a dead language, but it's still very much used. And Alcuin and Charlemagne very instrumental in why Latin is still a very powerful and much used language, even though it's not much of a spoken language. And so I want to start by thinking about the legacy of Charlemagne. And I said, well, didn't we already say that? Well, language and all that, but we're just going to review maybe a couple things and add one or two things to the legacy of Charlemagne. And a legacy is what's left behind. So once Charlemagne dies, it didn't start the day he died, but when he's gone, there's things that remain that stay for a long time that really affect the educational landscape and what happens in education because of his life and the things that happened during his life and the things that he did. So Charlemagne's legacy, and that's going to bring us, just going to send us past Charlemagne toward later on in the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages. And remember, whenever I say Dark Ages, half the lights go out in the room. So, anyway, his legacy. Well, what Charlemagne left behind was an upper class of society, which were the priest and the royalty, or the nobility. Maybe we should say priest and nobility. The upper class of society, the priests and the nobility, were better educated than any men for the next 4 centuries. Okay. So that tells us that, he left that behind, but other things he left behind contributed to the deterioration of that. Because those men were better educated, and as time went by, education did not progress. And I mean that in a good sense. We don't like progressive education today. But in the definitive sense of progress, education didn't progress, it regressed, it digressed, whatever. It did whatever that was. So, they were better educated. Another thing that developed out of Charlemagne's rule was that the clergy were used to teach all subjects. The clergy were used to teach all subjects, all ages, up to and even through the establishment of universities. So from the time of Charlemagne, and Charlemagne's time there wasn't really universities, but we're going to talk about the development, but from his time all the way up to even the establishment of universities. When they were established, it was clergymen who were teaching in universities. Now, after that time, we have some changes that come along as far as who's teaching. But from 800 to the 1200s or so, it's all clergymen that are doing the teaching of all subjects. Okay? Why do you think that was? Or can you think of any reasons why it would be the clergymen that would study everything? You know what? That's exactly what I was thinking. They had the time. What else did they have to do? All they had to do is get together their liturgy or something like that, and that was probably given to them by somebody else. I'm saying that without any knowledge of what they really had to do. But their life was devoted to one thing, so they had, and that thing, in that time, it was developing at least toward a very ritualistic thing that didn't take a lot of study. You just would do the thing, perform the actions, and of course you would have to talk to people. I'm not saying they sat there, they weren't all monks, but there were monks who had even more time. Okay? All they did is sit around and study. Right? So they had the time. They would study more than just the Bible. Because they realized, I would say, like everyone who's honest realizes, that the Bible and any kind of study is within the realm. I mean, you can't separate one study from another. If you study one thing, you're going to get yourself into other areas, and if you study it long enough, you've got to come to some religious answer to the questions that occur to you. So the clergy were used to teach all subjects. So, who decides what gets taught? We're just twisting the statement, we're just twisting the statement around. Who decides what gets taught? The clergy. Or as a term that we might use, I don't know if it's on the test or not, but the ecclesiastics, okay, churchmen. So churchmen decide what gets taught. So can you see, since we know a little bit of history, this is still, over 1,200 years ago. That presents a problem, doesn't it? Okay. Is it a problem that churches and churchmen decide what gets taught? Not necessarily. What's the problem here in history that churchmen decide what gets taught? In 800, in 900, 1000. Rebecca?
Getting taught heresy.
And why are they getting taught heresy?
Because the Roman Catholic Church is in power.
Because there's really only one church. There's only one established churchmen, group of churchmen. We know as Baptists, right? There's always people in there that believe the truth. Okay, but generally in culture, the culture becomes even more dominated by the Catholic Church, the Roman Church, let's call it. I'd rather call it a Roman Church, and that those Roman ideals, Roman Church ideals and thoughts and all of that is, if I teach a certain way because I believe a certain way. I teach certain things because I believe certain things. I decide other things are not important to teach because I believe certain things, and I believe that certain things are not important to teach. I'm not going to tell you that I'm not biased. Okay? Everyone is biased. As Ken Ham says, it's just a matter of whether you're biased about the right bias, right? Something, is that the way he says it? Because everyone has a bias. And so, can we say Charlemagne was wrong to educate the priesthood and the clergy? No. You wouldn't want a clergy who can't even read the Bible, right? Can't even understand the Bible. So he educates them, but what happens, I would say to no fault of his, in his legacy, it's only churchmen, it's only church people that are really educated, and then, because actually, the nobility was, but the nobility is doing other things. They're governing the people, and the churchmen have more time to study stuff, and then pretty soon it's them that are the only ones who can really teach anything, and then their bias comes in, and they decide what's worth learning and what's not worth learning. So, and that falls right in line with the idea, with the other thing left behind by Charlemagne is a very powerful papacy, a very powerful Roman Church. Now, it wasn't very powerful the moment he died, but it just grew in power. There were two people before Charlemagne. I'm trying to remember the little thing that I watched recently, but I think it was Charles Martel. Maybe it was. Anyway, 2 or 3 before Charlemagne, rulers, had been crowned king of a certain area by the Pope. Okay? Then Charlemagne comes along, and much to his surprise, he's visiting the Pope on Christmas Day in 800, and the Pope just had, he's talking to the Pope and probably giving him whatever, he had to kneel in front of him. I don't know how, we don't have the novel of how it happened. But much to his surprise, which a lot of people doubt that he was really surprised by it, the Pope pulls out a crown and crowns him emperor. Okay? There's a lot of political things going on at that time period. But, okay, if you're emperor of the whole world, you don't answer to anybody, do you? Except for the person that gave you the power. Right? Okay, I mean, we have the president of let's just talk about the office of the president of the United States. We won't talk about the president of the United States, we can talk about the office of the president of the United States. The most powerful position in the world. He can do whatever he wants. Actually, Art right now thinks he can't do whatever he wants. But he can do whatever he wants, right? No, he can only do what the people who gave him that power allow him to do. Okay, so if the Pope is the one who's given you the power, who has the power? So, now, there was a good relationship between Charlemagne and the Pope, and there's, and all this, but what happens? You've had church history, right? Or have you? Some of you have. What happens a couple hundred years later? We have a ruler standing in the snow outside a castle where the Pope inside makes him stay out there for a couple days in his bare feet because he didn't like the way the ruler was what was happening in the country. I mean, the Pope gets more and more and more power. Okay? And since the Pope has more and more power, his men, who are what? The ecclesiastics, the churchmen, have more power. And so what they think and what they believe controls education. Joy.
I don't know if this might be a weird question, but
That's a weird question.
why did Charlemagne have the Pope crown him emperor? Why did
He was
Charlemagne
surprised by it. He
crown
was
him?
totally surprised by it. No, it was a political move. So the Pope is losing power. He's the Bishop of Rome. He's probably called the Pope. Yeah, he is called the Pope. But let's just, to keep it connected to Rome, he's the Bishop of Rome. And he has influence over churches and people all over the world. Well, then there's a break between Eastern churches, which is Turkey, and Palestine and all of that. So now the Bishop of Constantinople, or whatever it is at that time, and I don't think he's called a bishop, but anyway, the head of the Church of Constantinople, his influence is swaying all those people. And then the Moors, which are the Muslims, they've come around and they've taken over all of Africa. They've crossed over into Spain. They're conquering all over. So places that the Bishop of Rome had influence over, he's losing influence. North of him, in Europe, is Charles the Great, Charlemagne, and he's expanding his power. And his grandfather was crowned by one of the Pope's predecessors. And so the Pope feels like if he can control or give his blessing to Charlemagne, then all the area that Charlemagne is taking over will come under his influence. It's a political move.
So Charlemagne didn't ask him to crown.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Historians are skeptical about one way or the other what was really going on there. Charlemagne also, he's controlling all this stuff, but when the Pope crowns him, the emperor, well then that means the people that listen to the Pope that aren't under his control are now under his control. So they both gain influence and power by this, if it's mutual agreement, if it's not, this accidental happenstance. Okay? Does that kind of make sense? It's not, it's interesting and it helps us understand, so it's a very good question, but it's not that it happened, and the effects of it is really more what we're talking about here in education. Yes?
So in a way, the Pope was then kind of giving up some of the term called political power, like giving up some of his power in order to
Well,
unite with the stronger political front. He could
It's-
have his
it wouldn't have been political power. At that point, the Pope didn't have political power. He had influence, but we're talking 800. He didn't have a real lot of political power. It was after that time even, it might have been a move of Charlemagne or after him, I can't remember, that, that they created the Papal States. So before that, he's the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, Papa, whatever. But he really doesn't have any civil authority. Sometime after Charlemagne, they make the Papal States, which is it's shrunk now to the Vatican, but it did go from sea to sea across the boot of Italy. And so he actually ruled that area. And so in this move, he ends up, or his office, I don't know if it's him, but the Pope's office ends up gaining political power also. He had political influence, obviously. So it's kind of a confusing time. Especially I was enlightened by the video that I saw. Because I like history, but it's not, I'm just looking at kind of the education strand. Okay, so the Pope gains, the Pope's office gains that power, and what happens because of that? Because he gains that power, we've implied it already, maybe even said it, this legacy ends up limiting the spread of knowledge in civilization, in Western civilization. Okay. It grew. The spread of knowledge and learning grew under Charlemagne, but his alliance with the Pope and the subsequent power that the church had, and then the continued apostasy of the church, and that the church doesn't want people to be learned, they just want them to do what they want them to know, takes away all the advances that had been made through 814 in education. Slowly they're taken away and lost, maybe not taken away, but lost by the increasing power of the Roman Church and churchmen. The Pope does gain even political power until he is able to, for different reasons, some financial, some political, or whatever, certain ones are able to give their endorsement or even themselves promote the raising of armies to go crusade against the Holy Land and recover cities and places from the Moors, from the Muslims, who were in different history say, who were not really menacing the pilgrims that were going to those places. Maybe they felt uncomfortable because they were in the middle of Muslims, but some histories, and I think they're fairly credible, would say that it really wasn't that many bad things happening, but it was more of a flex my muscles, bring money into the church type of thing, the Crusades. And that would be a reason why the Crusades generally have pretty bad reputation. I'm surprised that more, colleges who have crusaders as their mascots aren't protested against by people. I don't care if they're crusaders or not, but I'm not going to be a crusader. And I'm not going to crusade against their mascot, the Crusaders. So, anyway, but so then we have the Crusades, and we don't have the time to go into all the historical aspects of the Crusades. Two things come out of the Crusades. Okay, so boom, we're already 300 years later. Crusades are late 1000s, 1100s, 1200s. So I'm pretty sure that I'm right on my history there. So the Crusades happen, and in the Crusades, lots of different things happen. But one of the things that happen is, as they are traveling by land from Europe into the Holy Land to recover these Christian places, they take different routes, but many times they're traveled through Greece. You go to Greece, hop over to Turkey, come around Asia Minor, down into Palestine. As they go through Greece, what do they find? Who's our famous Greek educator? Or two, or three? They discover Aristotle and Plato. And of course, mostly Aristotle. I think Aristotle was way more prolific, and that means wrote a lot more than Plato. So, and some of the people going on these crusades are interested in education, or they're just interested in taking things. So they find this stuff, they just take it. And so a lot of Aristotle's works are being brought back. I mean, they don't lose everything on these crusades. Sometimes they lose an awful lot, but they don't lose everything. And so the works of Aristotle, the works of the ancient Greek poets, and all these learned people from 1,000 years before them, or 1,500 years before them, are brought back with them to home. And so there's the discovery of Aristotle's philosophical works and everything that goes along with that. That is an educational benefit or result of the Crusades. And then what they did with those, what do you think happened to all those works that they found? They did something to them. Not physical, it's not like they burned them or anything like that, or put them in wax paper.
My thought is that since this was the Dark Ages, it probably hit them with the people.
Okay, well, not necessarily. We should remember that the Dark Ages was a term used by the Enlightenment. Okay, so this is not a time that despises learning. A lot of people don't have learning because it's the prerogative of the ecclesiastics what they get. So if I'm, a knight, and I have shining armor, and I find this Greek writing, I can't read it. I can't read anything. I just know how to fight and be chivalrous. But I bring it back. Who do I bring it to when I bring it back? The churchmen. Now they can read. And they're interested in learning. So they're not going to hide it necessarily. What are they going to do to it though? Joy?
Will they kind of change it a little to fit?
Okay, they would not, they are going to change it, but not in the sense that you're saying, I don't think. Mary?
Copy it?
They're going to copy it, but not just copy it. When they copy it, they're going to change it in a certain way. Serenity.
Translate it?
Translate it. How many were thinking translate?
Oh, yes, one first.
Yes. Okay. And so they're going to translate it. And what are they going to translate it into? Okay, you remember reading about George Washington? Our founding fathers, when they were educated, what did they all have to learn? Latin. Why? Because everything that they wanted to learn was in Latin. Okay? So, we can find Aristotle in Greek, but when they got it, they put it into Latin because they all knew Latin. And if they were going to teach it, and they did teach. They did teach. We shouldn't think that they didn't teach during the Dark Ages. They just taught what they wanted to whom they wanted to. Okay? So all the Greek philosophers and the poets and stuff are all being translated into Latin. Latin is dominant. Latin dominates the world until 1700s. Okay? King James Bible comes along and it dominates, but it takes a little while English takes a while to overtake Latin. And it is still the language of science and learning, Latin is. Okay, so these Greek works are translated into Latin. So two things related out of the Crusades connected to education is that they discover all the learning of the Greeks, basically. They discover all the philosophy of Aristotle and all the poets and everything. Aristotle refers to other people, and they're finding all this. They begin studying that, and they translate all those classics into Latin. Because, of course, Latin has been established as the language of learning, the language of the language. It's the language of anything that's going to happen. I'm sure there are other, dialects and all that. The knight might have his Latin, I don't know, Southern Latin and New York Latin and all of that. All right. The next thing to think about, and during this middle period of history, is a very influential educator. Okay, he lived from 1225 to 1274, and this influential educator, since he lived in this time, what was he? A clergyman, right? So his name is, most people in the world today would call him Saint Thomas Aquinas. We'll just call him Thomas Aquinas, because we haven't canonized anyone in history. Saint Thomas Aquinas. A-Q. I saw that hand. A-Q-U-I-N-A-S. A-Q-U-I-N-A-S. Saint Thomas Aquinas. 1225 to 1274. So now he's born over 400 years after Charlemagne dies. Okay, he's born after the majority of the crusades have been taken, have been done. So he's born into a time period. I don't know his personal history that great, but we're just looking at what's happened generally. He's a churchman, so he's born into a time period where the church has discovered the philosophy of Aristotle and translated into Latin, and that becomes, if you're going to be a churchman, you're going to the monastery to learn, you're learning a lot, you're learning a real lot. Not, by this time, not much Bible at all. You're learning church doctrines, you're learning all kinds of things, and he is a churchman. I don't know how he starts into it, but he grows up and he's an ecclesiastic. And what I would say about him, and that I'd like you to remember, is that he marries Aristotle's philosophy to church dogma. Now Aristotle discovered, because he was made in the image of God, he discovered a lot of things that were true. But he's also a pagan. Okay? So not everything Aristotle says is accurate or true all the way. Aquinas takes Aristotle's philosophy, marries it to church dogma. And what he does by that is he kind of gives some reasonableness. Now put those quotes about it. He gives some reasonableness to church dogma. Before Aquinas, the church just said things. And they didn't have to explain why. They didn't even try. You just did it. Because they said it. They decided it. Aquinas comes along and he writes Summa Theologica. Okay? A body of theology. Or the sum. The sum of theology. Everything. You take this and you add this to it. You have the total sum of theology. Maybe that's what that means. I don't know that. But he writes this, and in this he starts taking church dogma and explaining it using Aristotelian logic and philosophy. And how many have read 50 Years in the Church of Rome? Okay? Whatever his name is, he talks about Aquinas in there. I don't know if you remember that. And he talks about some of the reasoning that Aquinas gave to church dogma. It's unbelievable. It doesn't make any logical sense. But if you think about it, there is a thread of logic. It's twisted, okay? And that's what Aquinas did. He takes logical terms and he brings church dogma and brings it together and gives it some quote-unquote reasonableness. He also, beside his Summa Theologicae, writes De Magistro, D-E, and then M-A-G-I-S-T-R-O, which means concerning the teacher. De Magistro, M-A-G-I-S-T-R-O. Did I spell it right? Yes. De Magistro. Concerning the teacher. So he is writing, as we're thinking educationally, he's writing about teachers. If you're going to be a teacher, this is what you need to do. This is the type of person you need to be. These are the things that you ought to do. And so he is quite influential, both in Catholic dogma and theology and in education. So, we're progressing, and we come to the place, I'm going to just kind of summarize and then get to universities. So, education through middle history, and of course we're talking middle history 1,000 years, so this kind of just fit this in where it makes sense. Education is conducted through churches. You don't, before this, you went to a teacher, right? A master, whatever. The Greeks and the Romans, there was teachers. But as the Roman Church falls, and then as it grows, and all of that, you no longer do you go to a teacher. Not that there wouldn't have been at any point in time, but as we get to the end of this period, we come to a point where we see education is done through churches. And then, if you wanted further education or secondary education, so primary education, if there's any, is done through churches. And I say if there's any, not saying that there isn't any. Okay, there isn't much. There's not much emphasis put on it because most of the people are not literate. But there are some literate people, and they had to start somewhere. So where they started was church. Secondary education, and what is secondary education to us? I'm trying to bring some modern terms into it. What is secondary education to us? I'm sorry? High school, yes. Okay, so primary is grade school, grammar school, grade school, secondary is high school. So secondary education is done at monasteries or cathedrals. Okay, so you got churches in the little hamlets and villages and whatever all across the land. In a larger city, where there's more people, there's going to be more churchmen, okay? And so there's going to be different levels of learning in different subjects, and so you could get a secondary type education in a larger city where there would be a larger church. There's probably smaller churches around even the large city, but there becomes one that is more dominant, that is a cathedral. And then you have the monasteries, which they're not necessarily, I don't know, we don't know where they are, but they could, I just imagine, they're in the country. It's black and white because it's the Dark Ages, but they're in the country, but there's more churchmen there because they have left their homes, they've come to this one place to just study. So there's more churchmen there, there's more knowledge there, there's more learning there, and you could get a secondary education there. So somebody whose parents or whatever, for whatever reason, they're interested in becoming a churchman, they're going to learn a little bit at the church, and then maybe the bishop or the priest says this boy shows, has potential. Talks to the parents and influences them to let him go to the monastery to learn more, okay? And he gets a secondary education. These large cathedrals in the cities, they continue to grow. And the cathedrals in the large cities grow into universities. Of course, there's other things happening in these cathedrals, but they grow into universities. Right, so that's kind of the development of the places of education in the Middle History period. Most, during this time period, were uneducated. Most, we're thinking about the people of this time period, they were uneducated. If you remember your Middle History or your Middle Ages or your Dark Ages, whatever history, we have the serfs, right? And they're not educated. They are educated. They know how to do the things that they're supposed to do, but they're not literate. They're not literate. So they don't have that literary education. Knights, they don't have that type of education. They're quite skilled in the things that they have to do, but, so they have some learning, right? But they're not literate. You know, they sign their name with an X. Women, okay, they don't have much education. Because one thing that the Catholic Church did have straight then is that women could not be priests. So women, why would a woman need to have any education? Okay, not much. And even the nobility. Charlemagne had tried to educate the nobility, but the nobility don't have much education. And I would say this is because of the strength, the growing strength of the church. Okay? The church is doing more of the work that the nobility was doing. The nobility was administering the state and all that. Now, there's, people are all in line, they're doing what they're supposed to do, and the priests and the church people are making sure everybody is, are good citizens. And so there's nobility and all of that. But they don't need much education either. They just have to do what the priest says. So, those in teaching, the scholastics, the academics, are monks and teaching clergy. Those are the ones that are teaching. And they do a lot of their teaching using a method called syllogism. Using a syllogism, and it's a term of logic, and the easiest way to say it's deductive reasoning. So if this is true, then this. If this is true and this is true, then this is true. If A and B, then C. That's the simplest syllogism, but. And deductive reasoning would be, this is true, and here's the points, the reasons why it's true. And then this is true, and here's the points, reasons why it's true. Syllogism, S-Y-L-L O-G-I-S-M. S-Y-L-L-O-G-I-S-M. I already mentioned that as Baptists, and anybody that's honest with history, we understand that not everybody was educated in this way. There were the Waldensians, the Albigenses, the Wycliffites, the Bohemian Brethren. There's always been people that understood, had the scriptures, believed them. Of course, they really educated their own children way more than the typical person in civilization did, at least to be able to read the scriptures. So, and since they could read the Bible for themselves, they at least had freedom in their soul, even though they might not have had much civil freedom. So, universities. They spring up in a lot of different places. The famous ones are Paris, Salerno, well, I don't know how you say it. It looks like baloney to me, but Bologna, Oxford, Cambridge, Heidelberg, Erfurt, Padua, I can't say these words, Prague, all these major cities across Europe. And they actually spring up, and one might be stronger in a certain area of knowledge than other ones. That happens. In the universities, this is what they study. They study the liberal arts, then they study the sciences, and then they go on to the professions. Okay? So you have the liberal arts, the sciences, and the professions. And they learn these I'm going to tell you what those are, and all of a sudden we're going to realize that this is the same stuff that the Greeks and Romans were learning way back. Okay? And in kind of in the same categories. I kind of hinted toward this, I remember earlier. So what are the liberal arts? There's 7 of them, and they're divided into 3 and 4. The trivium, which are linguistic based, grammar, logic or dialectic, and rhetoric. And then there's the quadrivium, which are numerically based, and you have, and this is, a lot of people wonder, like, how are these related? You know, why are they, and so I saw this explanation for it, and it helps me remember, so I always say them in this order. Arithmetic is based on units, okay? Ones. Music, you have to have 2 points to create music. You have a point here and a point here, and the string between them makes a sound. And you change the distance between those points, and you have different sounds. So there's 2 related to music, if you're trying to remember, which you don't need to remember because you can just look it up. But geometry, all geometry would include solid geometry, which is in 3 dimensions. Okay? And then in astronomy, we have 3-dimensional objects that are moving, which gives a 4th dimension to them. So 1, 2, 3, 4, quadrivium. Got it? Piece of cake. Arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy are the last 4. The quadrivium of the 7 liberal arts. I see questions, or I see ensemble members who are going to perform, going to sing for us in chapel that need to go off. Go, quick, so I can keep teaching. That's okay. So, that is the 7 liberal arts. Then you have the sciences. These terms are still around us. How many of you are getting a Bachelor of Arts? How many of you are getting a Bachelor of Science? Okay? How many of you ever heard of a Master of Arts? A Master of Science? Okay? So these terms are with us now still. So the sciences, there are, so if you have paper, this might come out a little messy. Okay? There are, let's see here, 1, 2, 3. There are 3 sciences. There are 3 sciences. There's natural science. And then there's moral science. And then there's theological science. Of course, theological science. Theology is the queen of the sciences. You might have heard that phrase before. So, under natural science, there are 2 types of natural science: physical and metaphysical. You should get this down. Just to have it as a bank in your bank of information. So, physical science is the observational things that we can observe. Metaphysical science, which is under the natural sciences, are the sciences of philosophical reflection. Okay? So religion, kind of at least religious ideas, philosophical reflection, what is joy, all those types of things. I said what, not who. What is joy? What are ideas? Where does so those are metaphysical sciences. Under moral sciences, pretty much moral sciences are the ones that involve mankind. So under moral sciences we have history. You didn't know history was a science, did you? Okay. History, politics, and law. So these are human interaction and social organization. Those are the moral sciences. What do you need?
I'm a little confused on this.
Well, yeah, it's messy on paper, sorry.
Moral is under.
Moral is parallel with natural.
Oh,
Moral is parallel with natural.
so what was metaphysical again then?
Metaphysical is parallel with physical, under natural.
And what's the definition then?
It's philosophical reflection. Okay? Then, the physical and metaphysical, especially metaphysical, we don't use that term much anymore. So, but under the moral sciences, we understand those. History, politics, and law. And then, theological sciences, you had studies in religion and first principles. Those would be the two subjects under theological science, religion and first principles. So you have the 7 liberal arts, you have the sciences, 3 sciences, and if you went beyond that, you would become a professional. You would study the professions. And there's only 3 professions. At this point in civilization, there's 3 professions. Obviously people do other things, but to be a professional, there's only 3 that needed this level of instruction and knowledge. And those would be, since the time of Egypt, law. You'd be a juris doctor, JD, juris doctor, jurisprudence, law. Medicine, an MD, medical doctor, and what? Huh? Clergy. Clergy, the church, a doctor, a DD, doctor of divinity. Okay, so if you're in any of those professions, you would have had, you'd be a master of the liberal arts. You'd have had all kinds of studies in the sciences, and then you'd move from there toward one of those, either law, medicine, or the church. It might interest you to know that our universities in America, normally the first state university in your state is, things change in 200 years, but is very strong in law and medicine and even in theology. Indiana University here in Indiana is a big medical school, a big law school, and they have a large theology department. We wouldn't go there, but they have a large theology department. Of course, they teach other things too, but that's their strength, because that's where, historically, what you learned in university. We're going to talk about where the other universities come when we get into American history. So, all right. 2 contributions of this total. We talked about Charlemagne's legacy. That was part of the Middle history. The 2 contributions of Middle history's history. What comes out of the Middle Ages for education? 2 things. One is the organization of knowledge. Actually, let's put before that the institutions of knowledge. Knowledge becomes institutionalized. Sure, before you would go to a teacher or something like that, but knowledge and learning is all over the place, and you can learn in a lot of different places. And you can still learn in a lot of different places, but we have, out of the Middle Ages comes the university. And with the university we have schools before it and places that you go to learn. That begins here. So that's, and then the other thing is the organization of knowledge into bodies. Remember, We had the Summa Theologica. You have a body of knowledge, you'll have a body of theology, a body of science. If you look at the old books, you have all these books that are called a body of something. So knowledge is organized into bodies. Before this time, there's a lot of knowledge, but you mixed what you knew. Because knowledge is all connected, isn't it? It's all, in Christ, everything's connected. Because it's created by God, it's all connected. But the more we know, the more we can't keep track of all of it. And so we begin to put knowledge into bodies. Knowledge you have science and mathematics and history and economics. Until now we have microbiological, whatever. We have a doctor that only deals with this small, tiny area, but there's so much knowledge about that small, tiny area that he can be a doctor just in that. Okay, now that begins at the end of middle history. We begin to put what civilization knows into bodies.